Started. My name is Sarah McDonough. I'm the programs manager. And what we are going to be doing today is sharing with you one of our favorite projects of the past, I think it was 13 years ago now that we made this film.
Heavens.
Which is, we've all been here longer than we care to admit.
Wow.
Which is a lovely introduction to what it is that actually happened here on April 19th, 1775. A good substitute for a in-person reenactment. And then we have some of our lovely reenactors here, including myself, who are experts in the field. A couple of us were in the film itself, and we have all the knowledge you could possibly want about what happened during the Revolution, how we ended up in this dreadful mess. And then we have some lovely music to round out the morning. So to begin with, I am going to share our film. And then we will introduce the rest of our lovely guests. Please enjoy.
The midnight hour is quiet in the home of Lexington minister Jonas Clark. Until the stillness is broken by a rider who appears out of the darkness.
Who's there? Revere from Boston. The family's retired and don't want to be disturbed by any noise.
Noise? You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are out.
The house comes alive with activity.
Adams.
Two prominent guests, Patriot leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, are apprised of the news.
The regulars are out in force. They're being rowed across.
As they consult with Clark and Revere, they are joined by William Dawes,
Deacon, welcome.
Hi, I bring news from Joseph Warren.
another express rider who is alarming the countryside. Within minutes, the bell on Lexington Common calls out the town militia. The day is April 19th, 1775. The war for independence is about to begin. Why it should commence on this day, in this place, is a story more than a dozen years in the making.
What do we mean by the American Revolution? The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. This radical change was the real American Revolution.
In 1759, Lexington farmer and wheelwright John Parker returns home after serving alongside the King's troops in the French and Indian War. He and thousands of other colonial volunteers return as loyal subjects, confident they have secured a safe and prosperous future under the British Crown. But in the conflict they have helped to win are sown the seeds of the revolution that will follow. The French and Indian War so drains Britain's treasury that King George and his ministers decide to raise money by taxing the colonies. British soldiers are defending America's frontier, they reason. The colonists ought to help pay the bill. In 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act, the first of several laws imposing taxes on the American colonies. To Britain's dismay, angry colonials protest that taxation without representation strips them of their rights. In Lexington, Minister Jonas Clark captures the town's outrage with a resolution condemning the Stamp Act.
That the world may see and future generations know that the present both knew and valued the rights they enjoyed and did not tamely resign them for chains and slavery.
In the years that follow, the citizens of Lexington watch as events unfold in Boston that will rock the colonies. The Stamp Act riots, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. But Lexington does more than just watch. The town becomes a stronghold of colonial dissent. In August of 1769, 45 women bring their spinning wheels to a house right on the common to hold a spinning bee. It is a form of public protest. To show their support for a colonial boycott on British products, they are turning out homespun as an alternative to imported British cloth. Many of the wheels have been made by John Parker, who has seen a sharp increase in spinning wheel orders from women eager to support the patriot cause.
Have your tea.
On December 13th, 1773, 3 days before the Boston Tea Party, the citizens of Lexington burn their tea in a common bonfire. A town meeting passes a stirring resolution written by Jonas Clark, who has emerged as a powerful voice on behalf of the American cause.
If any person from this time forward purchase or consume any tea, such person shall be looked upon as an enemy to this town and to this country. Should the state of our affairs require it, we shall be ready to sacrifice our estates and everything dear in life, yea, and life itself, in support of the common cause.
In support of the common cause!
3 days later comes the Boston Tea Party. Parliament responds by closing the port of Boston in 1774. The closure is enforced by 3,000 British soldiers who, through no fault of their own, find themselves targets of intense hostility.
We were in imminent danger every evening of being insulted by the inhabitants. The worst of language was continually in our ears. Jeremy Lister, 10th Regiment of Foot.
Across the colonies, in taverns like John Buckman's in Lexington, men debate the latest developments. Sitting by the fire in one country tavern, John Adams overhears just such a discussion.
As I believed I was unknown to all of them, I sat in total silence to hear them. One said, "What would you say if a fellow should come to your house to tell you that he was come to make a list of all your cattle, that Parliament might tax you for them at so much a head?" "What would I say?" replied another. "I would knock him on the head." "Well, if Parliament can take away Mr. Hancock's wharf and Mr. Rowe's wharf, they can take away your barn and my house." After much more reasoning in this style, a farmer, who had as yet been silent, broke out.
"I think it's high time we rebel."
Patriot leaders form a provincial congress that calls on Massachusetts towns to ready their militia. Lexington appoints John Parker captain of its militia company. 3 days after Christmas of 1774, a special town meeting convenes in Buckman Tavern to approve emergency expenditures for the militia.
Our militia need bayonets.
Yeah. But what of the cost?
We need the means to resist. We do.
Gentlemen, we have a resolution before us. Resolved that bayonets be provided at the town's cost for 1/3 part of the training soldiers in this town. Let us have the
Acts of colonial defiance such as this are reported to General Thomas Gage, commander of the British troops in Boston, who sends a prophetic warning to London.
This province and the neighboring ones are preparing for war. If you think 10,000 men sufficient, send 20. If £1 million is thought enough, give too. You save both blood and treasure in the end. General Thomas Gage.
Gage sends out several expeditions to seize colonial munitions, with mixed results. When orders from London demand even more aggressive action, he reluctantly launches another mission in April of 1775. This one will change history. On the night of April 18th, Gage dispatches an elite force of grenadiers and light infantry, more than 700 men, to seize colonial artillery and ammunition hidden in Concord. Their route will take them through Lexington. For more than a decade, the town has simmered with increasing anger. Once loyal subjects, the people of Lexington are now fully aroused. This is the place the war will begin.
Fix, bed up.
Near dawn on April 19th, the king's troops approach the town.
Shoulder, arms.
They seek no fight here. But to their surprise, some 80 Lexington militiamen are drawn up on the common. Parkers and Monroes, Harringtons and Muzzies, men determined to take a stand.
Steady, lads. Steady, lads. Steady, lads.
5 companies at the head of the British column deploy to meet the threat.
Steady, I said, damn you.
Major John Pitcairn orders the militia to disperse. The Lexington men are badly outnumbered, and at Captain Parker's direction, some begin to move off. Accounts vary widely as to what happened next. The only thing both sides agree on is that somebody fired a shot.
Eight were left dead on the ground. 10 were wounded. The rest of the company, through divine goodness, were to a miracle preserved, unhurt in this murderous action.
Three cheers for His Majesty King George! Hep, hep! Huzzah! Hep, hep! Huzzah! Hep, hep! Huzzah!
The regulars reach Concord by mid-morning. After a skirmish at North Bridge, they begin to fall back. Militia from more than 30 towns converge on the Redcoats, including the men of Lexington. Despite the grievous losses suffered at dawn, they grimly resolve to rejoin the fight and lay a deadly ambush for retreating British. By the time they make it back to Lexington, the British are on the verge of collapse. They are saved by a column of reinforcements led by Earl Percy.
Sergeant Wolf, give me 5 minutes, then come.
While the combined forces regroup, the regulars use Monroe Tavern as a field hospital to tend to their growing number of wounded.
I received a shot through my right elbow joint. At Lexington, I got Mr. Symes, surgeon's mate to the 43rd Regiment, to examine my arm when he extracted the ball, it having gone through the bone and lodged within the skin. Ensign Jeremy Lister.
The beleaguered British march out of town in mid-afternoon. A fierce battle continues all along the road back to Boston. Over the course of the day, 49 colonials and 73 British soldiers lose their lives. Nothing will ever be the same.
The Battle of Lexington on the 19th of April changed the instruments of warfare from the pen to the sword. A few days after this event, I rode to Lexington and along the scene of action for many miles and inquired of the inhabitants about the circumstances. These were not calculated to diminish my ardor in the cause. They, on the contrary, convinced me that the die was cast, the Rubicon passed. If we did not defend ourselves, they would kill us.
All right, thanks for sticking with us, everyone, and welcome to any newcomers. I saw that we had some last-minute registrants, so I hope you are all able to get in here. Who needs to? I will be continually checking on that. For anyone who wasn't able to get in at the beginning of the program, I am going to drop a link down into the chat window where you can access this film if you weren't able to see the whole thing. And now we will get into the meat of our program. So, hopefully we will get everyone into gallery view here. And I would just like to introduce our speakers for the day. As I mentioned, my name is Sarah McDonough. I'm the programs manager here, and I am also a professional turncoat as someone who likes to speak about both the Patriot and British side of the conflict. And I'm also here to represent the ladies as Abigail Adams would have wanted. And we also have two of our wonderful historical society jacks of all trades, Barry Cuna and Paul O'Shaughnessy. Would you two like to give a brief introduction before we get going?
Sure. You go ahead, Barry.
Okay. I'm actually the current president of the Lexington Historical Society. Paul is a past president. Also past commander of the Lexington Minutemen Company. I've been a Minuteman since 1991, I think, was when I joined the company. And have lived in Lexington most of my life, so that's why I'm so indebted to all that has happened with this film and everything that occurs around it. Of course, we would not have the great show we would have on every April 19th if it wasn't for the great Paul O'Shaughnessy, who makes the whole event come alive. And with that, Paul, I'll give it to you.
All right. Well, from humble origins, I grew up in Lexington. I've also been here most of my life. I am a member of the His Majesty's 10th Regiment of Foot, a replica or recreation of one of the British regiments that participated in the events of April 19th. I was the commanding officer at the time the film was made until about 6 years ago. And also past president of the Historical Society. And I do volunteer work around at a number of the houses, things of that sort. So, and all of us work very closely together to bring the details of this history out to everyone. We work with the Park Service. We work because people come to Lexington and they don't really understand or care that there's a historical society and a national park and these other things and the 10th Regiment and the Minutemen. We all just work together so that we can bring a seamless presentation to everyone and hopefully educate everyone in how this works or what happened in the day.
Right.
Wonderful. All right. So if anyone would really like to pick our brains, this is probably the best part of the program. Normally, this time of the day, we would be giving very frequent tours of our museums and wandering about the town, doing parades, getting to share with everyone the history that took place here 250 years ago. And today we get to do that virtually. So if you hover your mouse around the bottom of your screen, you will see a little button marked Q&A. And this is the place to put your questions. You can ask anything you like about what it was that actually happened on April 19th, how we got to this point, what it's like to be a reenactor, or what it's like being in a documentary. Have you two been in any other interesting historical films of late?
Well, I can talk about one that's come back out onto, I think it's on Amazon Prime right now, and it's called April Morning, and it's I think it's a Howard Fast book, if I'm correct about that. I can't remember, but it was turned into a Hallmark movie way back when there were these specials on TV. This is going back a number of years, I think at least 25 years or so, if not, it has to be even much more. It has to be like 35 years ago or more.
Yeah.
It was 1980s, I think, something like late 1980s actually. So, we all went up to Canada, and and we were on the set, and we had Rip Torn and I forget some of the other people, we had there were a number of movie and TV stars were in this at the time. So we've appeared in a lot of documentaries, things of that sort, but that was a particularly interesting one because we basically we had to go up to this little field in the middle of Quebec, Canada, and cross the border with all these guns. and they got everything through in about a day, and it worked out very, very well. And the film isn't bad. It follows the events of April 19th. And so look it up. Next time you're on Prime Video, take a look.
Also, those on PBS, like the American Experience, they did they did a show called Patriots Day.
Right.
And that was Paul and I were both very much involved in that. In fact, I think we're both listed as key reenactors or something like that. And we had
something of the sort. Yeah.
So that was done by a very good friend of mine who had later actually became a patient of mine, the director Marion Mazinski. Remember Marion?
Oh, I do. I remember Marion Marzinski. Yep.
Yeah.
Very,
and we've done various other ones. There's been a couple of YouTube videos that we've done that appeared. One was by an actor who used to be in soap opera. I forget his name. Another one was How Booze Built America. Remember that one, Paul?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
How Booze Built America. That was also very famous on the web. You can probably still find that.
Right. Other very recent ones, at least one that I did was for, there's an organization in and around Boston led by the Massachusetts Historical Society called Revolution 250. And people may know if they do the math, or you may just know that we are rapidly approaching in 2025 the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord and the opening of the Revolutionary War. In fact, we've already done a number of events leading into that, because by that timeline, the British have already arrived in Boston, and things are already going pretty sour in the town. And with, as you may know, with the Boston Massacre, and then eventually the Boston Tea Party, and then a rapid descent into rebellion, which I'm going to have a talk with you about, Barry.
Those intolerable acts, we'll never agree with those.
Well, you just grin and bear it, don't you?
Certainly not. All right, so our questions are beginning to come in, so I'm just going to cut you guys off there.
Sure, go right ahead.
But going into that, we are probably going to have a few people who are interested in how you two feel about who fired the first shot.
Well, I have my opinions.
Yeah,
but if
we
you'd
all
like
have
to take a shot at it.
We all have our biases. Go ahead, Paul. You can go first. What do you
All right.
think?
Well, I do believe my sense so the accounts from the Minutemen largely say, you know, the British fired first, and I think that could be an impression that you would get. I believe that the British accounts, and of course the British accounts tend to say that the Americans fired first, the militiamen on the green. I don't think either of them on the green actually did. The best, the most authentic accounts that I've read talk about a single shot being fired from behind a stone wall, and the location is somewhere off to the Buckman Tavern side, sort of I'd say the east or northeast side of the green. And we don't know the motivation behind that. Possibly somebody thought he was going to be a hero and pick off an officer, something like that. But or somebody's gun misfired. We don't really know. But that's the trigger. And then the British, by all accounts, fire largely without orders, a ragged volley into the ranks of the militiamen at very close range, well under 100 feet, I think, and all mayhem ensues. That's my take on it.
Well, interestingly enough, Paul, my take is very similar. I don't think it was a militiaman, unless it was a musket that misfired, which used to happen quite often. These were guns that were used for hunting and everything else, and they very, very often misfired these muskets. So it's a possibility that may have happened. But I agree with you. I think that someone by Buckman Tavern, whether they'd had a little too much to drink that night or they were just very angry, fired a shot. And I think that probably is what happened.
Yeah, I have a slightly sinister possibility. I'm not saying that this is what happened, but in every revolution, in every revolt, there are people who want to start something. And this was a golden opportunity to do exactly that. And there may have been some people out there who were going to see it happen, no matter what it cost. And they may have been responsible for pulling that trigger.
Yeah, well,
we don't know who they were. Yeah,
Sam
I'm
Adams
thinking
especially was a real, troublemaker, and he would have loved to have been the one that fired that first shot. And if he was
right. I don't think he was, but
no,
there may have been some, because he was nowhere near there.
Right,
but there may have been somebody who had listened to him a few too many times.
Yeah.
Great. All right, so here is another question for you, Paul, from Herb. Were the British soldiers actually into the politics of going against the colonies, or were they just doing their job and got roped into this against their will?
Well, they didn't get roped into it because the British Army, despite what you may think, was actually a volunteer force. You had to enlist. And you, of course, once you were in, you had obligations. And then the regiments were moved around. I don't think many of them expected to end up in Boston. The 10th Regiment, my regiment, particularly was headed back to Ireland after a stint in Canada, but they got diverted. So I'm sure that, I know that they were not happy about being in Boston, and they felt that they had been pulled into something not of their making. But there was a political angle. The soldiers were treated very, very poorly by the Bostonians, and so that really hardened attitudes quite seriously. The writings and comments that we have from many of the soldiers are very harsh about the Bostonians in particular, and New Englanders in general. That you know, they just you give them an inch and they take a mile, and they're completely uncompromising and impossible to work with. So amongst the men, I think there's a pent-up anger, and there's probably not a lot of depth to their political views, perhaps, but there's definitely a real bias against them. Amongst the officers, the interesting thing is that many of the officers arrive here with a rather Whiggish view of things, meaning that they weren't actually terribly conservative. A lot of them are upper middle or high, rather relatively high class, and they actually have very liberal ideas, and there's a lot of support in England for the colonial cause. And they maintain this sort of liberal attitude until they get to Boston and they start actually dealing with these people one-on-one, and then they end up despising them, and their writings about these people just start to spiral in, and they really have some pretty harsh words for them. So a lot of that, it's not so that the point I would like to make is that the British Army, they were not monolithic or uniform. They reflected their society, which had both conservative and liberal points of view. But once dealing with the New Englanders, they tended to harden their hearts. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. All right, so for those of you who are tuning in, I just put a link down in the chat window to both our completely free 3D online tour of the Hancock Clark House, which does include the video that we played at the beginning of this program. And all of this will be available in the next couple of days on our YouTube channel, which is also linked down there. So for our next question, Barry, this might be one that you would be interested in, because I know that the Minutemen do an incredible amount of research prior to going on the green. Jesse is curious how the reenactors form their sense of character. Could you share some of what inspires that for you?
Yeah, actually, the Lexington Minutemen are just unique among reenactment companies in that each member of the Minutemen is assigned a character who was on the green that day. And it is our obligation to research that character in as many sources as we can find. And we've gone as far as the National Library. We've got sources from Great Britain. We'll go all over to try to get as much as we can. We have some of our members are actual historians who've written novels, who've written books. There was one very good book written on Joseph Warren by one of our members. We have another member, George Quintal, who has accumulated an entire biography of all of the members of the Lexington Minutemen who were there. Has taken all the biographies we have. And we're obligated that within the year of joining the company that we have researched our company, and it is up online. So for anybody who's interested in hearing about some of the people who are on there, our information is online. Just go to lexingtonminutemen.org and you'll be able to find the characters and any information. Some of you out there may even be related. We have members of our company who are related to militiamen who were on the green that day. So that's basically what it is. But we take a great pride in researching our character and trying to portray him as realistically as possible, especially on the day of the reenactment on April 19th.
Wonderful. And those of you who were out and about in town and yesterday may have met George. He was giving tours of the green. So if you want to know a lot of information, our town guides are also very knowledgeable, and many of them are reenactors as well. So I have a couple of quick questions here. Do we know what the casualties were that day in terms of numbers?
Well, on the green, there was one British soldier slightly wounded in the leg. His name was Johnson.
Johnson, yeah.
Yeah.
And Pitcairn's horse was hit, right?
Yes, Pitcairn's horse was hit, I think, twice.
Yeah.
We don't know by whom, because he was riding in front. He was sort of he got caught in the middle.
Wasn't he trying to divert the troops to the southern side to get them off to move the troops off to the left?
It's a little tough to reconstruct exactly what he was doing. He was out in front, sort of reading the riot act to you guys, and then all mayhem breaks loose. So I think he's trying to control things, but where he was exactly, I'm not sure what his plan was. I believe the number is on the green. There were 8 militiamen killed, and I believe it was 10 wounded. Is that correct? Yes.
That's correct. Yep.
And by the end of the day, I think it was 70 something.
70 British.
73, I believe, if I could recall. British. I should know.
I think it was 49.
49 Americans. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Of course, you can't call them Americans now. You have to say militia.
Yeah. Militiamen of the colonials, if you wish.
Right.
And then I believe there were about 100, and it was something like 140, or I forget exact numbers, of the British, and another couple of dozen or so that were missing. So all in all, there were several hundred, a few hundred actually, casualties of one sort or another on the British side. Out of the original 700 who arrived, who marched out with Smith in the morning, and then the roughly maybe more than 1,000, we believe, maybe around 1,200 that came out with Earl Percy, called at roughly 2,000 men. You're talking about over 10% of their force that does not come back, or comes back wounded in one way or another, or killed or whatever. So pretty serious day for the British.
And that does bring up the question, which is asked quite frequently: when did they stop saying regulars and start saying British?
Well, you're right. I think we've been using the wrong terminology here. We have skipped ahead in time a bit without realizing it, and started talking about British and Americans, when in fact that was a very blurry distinction at the time. I would better call it friends of government, or loyal, those who were loyal, and those who believed in sort of the established law and order of the day, were on one side of this. And then you have the colonials, or the provincials, or the militia that had gone over to the provincial side or into this revolutionary side. And they are, so this is really a civil war. This is the same society. It's splitting between those loyal to a particular political path and those who see a different and new path, and want to break away from it, or at least come to a better agreement with the mother country. I think this evolves very quickly.
Yeah, you got to remember, at this time, most people did not want to break away from Great Britain. And there was a lot of loyalists, especially in other parts of the country. I mean, the Southerners referred to the Bostonians as those rabble rousers in Boston, as Paul alluded to earlier about the nature of the Bostonians. And so this was very early on. We were still trying to settle things. It was this spark that kind of was the defining moment that said, there's no turning back now. But there was a lot of loyalists still. New York City especially had a lot of loyalists in the city itself. So
right. And one thing also about loyalists is that they very often were not lockstep believers in everything the king or parliament did. Right. They were, many of them, like Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts, the previous governor, had gone to London on his own dime to argue the American cause and to try to reason with these people. But in the end, he was labeled a loyalist because he would not cross that Rubicon into rebellion. He simply wouldn't go there. But he was as good and as loyal an American or a Massachusetts man as any. His family had been here from the beginning.
Yeah.
So
I think a lot of people don't know that Benjamin Franklin had done the same thing and gone on a diplomatic mission to England in hopes of quieting things down. He did not want to, at the time, separate. He was practically run out on a rail from Britain. And it was after that he decided things weren't going to get any better.
Right.
He became,
And then I can say this: the government in London pursues a rather reactionary path and a military path. They do what so many governments do. They send in the army and tell them to fix it.
Yeah, yeah.
And gee golly, it doesn't always work.
Yeah, as we're getting into all of these anniversaries, it does make me think of the number of accounts that I have read. So much of what we know about what happened comes just as much from the recollections of very old men as they do from the immediate aftermath of the battle. And I have noticed that, you know, by the time these people are writing their recollections at the 50th anniversary, they're already saying British. And I think that has a lot to do with it, how we perceive what happened that day, because we have accounts that were taken a week after the battle and accounts that were taken 50 years after the battle when the language had changed quite a bit.
Right. Importantly, I think it's very important. I'm sort of taking a slight tangent here, but I think it'll be illustrative. It's very important to understand that at the moment on April 19th in 1775, the Army, I just did it again, British Army, the Army in Boston is referred to as the Ministerial Army. They've been sent here by Parliament. This is a dispute between parliaments. It's a dispute between the Massachusetts and other colonial or provincial legislatures and the mother parliament in London, ingressing, in their opinion, on their prerogatives. And there is still great hope and loyalty in the king. There's that thought, if we can just get through to him, you know, if he can just get him to understand. And there's hope that the king, whose one job in the view of colonials is to protect their rights and protect their privileges under the umbrella of a monarchy. And he just needs to come forward, tells Parliament to sit down and shut up and let them go on with their lives, and all will be well. Yeah. When he doesn't do that, that's when the real break comes. Yeah. But there's real hope. Even after the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, there is still hope of somehow getting the king to act and do his job. In the view of the colonials, he has one job, and then he doesn't do it.
Yeah. So I think you're right, Paul. That's very important. Even Captain Parker and the militia and so forth, when they refer to the transgressions, they refer to Parliament. They do not refer to the king.
Right.
And so, and that's really where the problem was with Parliament. And like Paul said, Parliament itself was fractured. There were many loyalists until April 19th. That turned the tide in Parliament as well, pretty much.
Right, right.
All right.
I hope somewhere in there, I hope we answered a question.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take a little digression here because I was planning a grand introduction at the end of this for our friend Diane, but we do actually have a question about music. So perhaps if you're interested in popping in for the last portion of our program this morning, we have the wonderful Diane Taraz, who is the leader of our colonial singing troupe. She has made many albums of colonial music, both on her own and with us. And she will be performing for us in just a few minutes. But before that happens, we do have some questions about how did music actually bring people together, sort of socially and politically in the 18th century? Because I think a lot of the history we learned from back then is in the form of music. Everyone knows Yankee Doodle.
Did you want Diane?
Muted Diane.
Diane.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, now I'm unmuted. That was in case I suddenly sneezed or something. I didn't want to disrupt anything. Oh, hello? Am I still there?
You're good.
You're there. You're good.
Okay. All right. Well, music was very prevalent everywhere in the 1700s. And there I am. I'm back. And it did bring people together, particularly in church. Religion is no longer such a huge part of our lives, but back then people went to 2 services every Sunday, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, And there was actually a revival going on in New England where people were particularly fervent. So hymns and singing together in church was major. And then the other interesting thing is that people used music as propaganda. We have songs that were created specifically either to promote loyalty to the king or to argue that we needed to rebel. And almost never was new music written for these songs. You would pick out one of the hundreds of melodies everybody had running through their head and say, sing these words to this melody. And but there was a huge amount of what we would consider propaganda music created. So yeah, it was people sang while they worked, and they had their lives were filled with repetitive tasks that took a while, like churning butter or chopping wood, and they would just walk a bunch of miles. There's a song that starts, "We had not been walking but a few miles together." As just toss that out. Oh, we got up in the morning, we walked 6 or 7 miles. Something we don't do much today either. And of course, while you're walking, a good rolling marching tune is good. And marching, certainly. Soldiers were coordinated by bugle calls and by drums particularly, and fifes, which cut through the air since they had no radios. So, and certainly a good regimental song gathered everyone up. I'm actually going to do, this leads me right into what I'm going to do. Perhaps I should just do it. Are you ready for me to start?
We're just about at the hour mark, so I think that's a good idea. In the meantime, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the other questions in our Q&A box and answering as many of them as I can, typing them out. Okay. And I believe that the audience does have the ability to see them, so hopefully we will be able to get everyone's questions answered by the end of the day. One last one that I would like to address that popped up in the chat instead, before we get to the final portion here, is just about some of the objects that we have in our museums and how they help to tell the story. And that's the best part, I think, of our museums, is that we have this local connection. Our Lexington families, for the most part, have helped to preserve their own history. We have oral histories from the families. We also have the physical buildings and their contents, often from the families themselves. The room that I'm sitting in right here is new, but I can see from my seat into the original Monroe Tavern that was passed down directly from the Monroe family. And in fact, we had members of the family living in the house on and off until the 1970s. So if you come in here for a tour at any time, you'll be able to see all of those objects as they were in the time period, not reproductions for the most part, not objects that were brought in from other places. Buckman Tavern has the most outside objects because the Buckmans themselves didn't save a lot. But in some of our other properties, we have so many wonderful objects with stories to tell. And our curator, Stacy Fraser, is going to be giving a behind-the-scenes tour of some of those objects on Friday afternoon. So if anyone is interested in hearing more about that, be sure to go to our website, lexingtonhistory.org, and check that out. That is also an admission by donation event. And any donations that you give to these programs will go towards helping not only to present more programs like this, but also to preserve those objects for the future. And we do occasionally do fundraisers for individual objects in our collection that are in need of help. Generally, we run those large-scale fundraisers in the spring, but we will occasionally put notifications on our website if we are looking for donations for a specific object. So be sure to check out lexingtonhistory.org for that. All right, so without further ado, as I mentioned, our friend Diane is a very prolific musician and has been studying the history of music and performing it for many years. She also does wonderful theatricals with the Historical Society. We've performed the Beggar's Opera a few times in our space, and we are hoping that in the near future we will be able to continue to present some 18th century musical theater in all its hilarity to you. Mm-hmm. So Diane, I'm gonna spotlight your video.
Okay.
Whenever you are ready.
All right. Well, the rallying cry of the revolution was no taxation without representation. Not just no taxation, as we've heard, colonists knew why Parliament was taxing them, to retire the enormous debt built up defending the colonies in the French and Indian War. Who else should pay the piper but the people whose bacon had been saved, if we could mix metaphors? Well, during the French and Indian War, George Washington was a colonel in the British Army, and he no doubt marched to the British Grenadiers, one of the regiment's proudest songs. I know Paul can sing along if he's on mute. Some talk of Alexander and some of Hercules, of Hector and Lysander and such great names as these. But of all the world's great heroes, there's none that can compare with a tow-row-row and a row-row-row to the British Grenadiers. Those heroes of antiquity never saw a cannonball, or knew the force of powder to slay their foes withal. But our brave boys do know it and banish all their fears. Sing a tow-row-row and a row-row-row to the British Grenadiers. There are more verses, but I'll just give you those. Well, one British officer in the French and Indian War was not impressed by the Yankees he had to serve alongside. As Paul said, they were kind of prickly people. And this officer wrote a song poking fun at them. And he didn't write new music. He picked out a melody that was so old it was known as the air from who knows where. And this is what he wrote. Yankee Doodle went to town a-riding on a pony. He stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Now, a macaroni was a gigantic Italian wig, and it was worn by European men just encrusted with finery, with silk and lace and powder and wigs and whatnot. And the joke is that this doodle, this fool, thinks he's as fashionable as a macaroni because he stuck a turkey feather in his hat. Here's another verse that this officer wrote. He says, Brother Ephraim sold his cow and bought him a commission. This is a very inglorious way to become an officer. Brother Ephraim sold his cow and bought him a commission, and then he went to Canada to fight for the nation. But when Ephraim he came home, he proved an arrant coward. He wouldn't fight the Frenchmen there for fear of being devoured. Well, by the 1770s, colonists had made this song their own, creating dozens of new verses, some of them a bit disrespectful, but poking fun at themselves particularly. And the melody had evolved a little bit. First we take a pinch of snuff and then a drink of water, and then we say, how do you do? And that's a Yankee supper. Sheep's head and vinegar, buttermilk and tansy. Boston is a Yankee town, sing Yankee Doodle Dandy. Our Jemima's lost her mare and can't tell where to find her, but she'll come trotting by and bring her tail behind her. Two and two may go to bed, two and two together, and if there is not room enough, lie one atop the other. There were dozens of these verses. Well, the sticking point, as we have heard, was not the taxes themselves, though many people hated them. The problem was that they were decided in Parliament and colonists had no representatives there, so they saw tax acts as tyranny if they had no say in them. In 1770, Dr. Joseph Warren wrote some defiant verses advocating rebellion. As chair of the Committee of Safety, he sent Paul Revere riding all over the colonies for years, carrying messages. And Warren set his treasonous verses, declaring that there should be a free Amerique to Britain's proudest marching tune, the British Grenadiers. This is a way to really drive home your point. And he did 9 verses. I'll just give you a couple of them. Lift up your hands, ye heroes, and swear with proud disdain. The wretch that would ensnare you shall lay his snares in vain. Should your bounty all her force, we'll meet her in array, and fight and shout and shout and fight for free America. Torn from a world of tyrants beneath this western sky, we formed a new dominion, a land of liberty. The world shall own we're free men here, and such we'll ever be. Huzzah, 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 huzzah for free America. And now Warren looks ahead. This is a time when we didn't have a navy. We had a few little boats. But he looks ahead and says this: some future day shall crown us as masters of the main. Our fleet shall speak in thunder to England, France, and Spain. Nations o'er the ocean spread shall tremble and obey the prince who rules by freedom's laws in North America. That was a pretty outrageous statement at the time. And he didn't know we'd have a president. He says, we'll have a prince, but he will rule by freedom's laws. Well, the Townshend Acts of 1767 taxed paint and glass and tea, and colonists mounted a 2-year boycott that caused huge losses in British trade. And this song appeared in the Boston Newsletter in 1769. It's called Young Ladies in Town, and it asks young women to lead the way in keeping the boycott. Don't buy British cloth, make your own homespun, as we saw on the Lexington Green. Accept no proposals of marriage from those not keeping the boycott. And don't drink the tea. You're supposed to throw away your bohea and your green hyson tea, they said tea back then, and instead drink Labrador, also known as Indian tea, made from an evergreen bush. Young ladies in town and those that live round, wear none but your own country linen. Of economy boast, let your pride be the most, to show clothes of your own make and spinning. If homespun, they say, be not quite as gay as brocades, be not in a passion. For once it is known, 'tis much worn in town, one and all will cry out, 'tis the fashion. And as one agreed, you'll not married be to such as will wear London factory. At first sight refuse, pray tell 'em you'll choose to encourage our own manufactory. No more ribbons wear, nor in rich silks appear. Love your country much better than fine things. Begin without passion, 'twill soon be the fashion to grace your smooth locks with a twine string. Throw away your bohea and your green hyson tea, and all things of a new fashion duty. Get in a good store of the choice Labrador, there will soon be enough here to suit ye. These do without fear, and to all you'll appear fair, charming, true, lovely, and clever. Though times remain starkish, young men will be sparkish, and love you much stronger than ever. Wonderful song. It was anonymous, of course, and they didn't give any music. They said, sing this to the tune of whatever. Well, as Paul pointed out, people were trying to reconcile with the mother country, and in 1768, John Dickinson wrote new verses for the melody Heart of Oak, a famous British naval melody, in which he says, our purses are ready, but only if we are treated as free men and not as slaves. The word slave sets our teeth on edge, but it was an accepted part of life back then. The last verse drinks a health to King George, hoping that he will see the justice of their cause. So this is the Liberty Song. And it's strange to us to hear drinking a health to King George, but he was hopefully going to save us. Come join hand in hand, brave Americans all, and rouse your bold hearts at fair liberty's call. No tyrannous axe shall suppress your just claim, or stain with dishonor America's name. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready, steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men, our money will give. This bumper I crown for our sovereign's health, and this for Britannia's glory and wealth. That wealth and that glory immortal may be, if she is but just, and if we are but free. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready, steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men, our money will give. Okay. Well, both free black people and enslaved men served in the Continental Army, and some rose to the rank of colonel in New England regiments. George Washington initially was very unhappy about their presence, but as in a New England maritime town and on board a ship, if you could do the job, you were welcome, no matter who you were. And they did fairly well in the Continental Army. Well, events, as we know, came to a head on April 19th, and men and a few women disguised as men marched off to serve. And once they disappeared over the hill, you might hear nothing more about them, ever. There was no mechanism for keeping track of soldiers, no dog tags. Hopefully their commanders might write to you, but the mails were not very reliable either, especially with a war on. What a strain on the nerve of loved ones. Bye, dear. You have no idea if you'll ever see them again. And this song kind of captures this. It's an old Irish song called "Johnny Has Gone for a Soldier," and in the chorus we have a little bit of Gaelic still left. It says "Shul Arun," which means my treasure. So. Here I sit on Buttermilk Hill, who can blame me, cry my fill, and every tear would turn on nil. Johnny is gone for a soldier, sure, 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 and he loves me. When he comes back, we'll marry me. Johnny is gone for a soldier. Me, oh my, I loved him so. Broke my heart to see him go. And only time will heal my wound. Johnny's gone for a soldier. Sure, sure, Sharon, sure, sure, and he loves me. When he comes back, we'll marry me. Johnny's gone for a soldier. And I made a YouTube video of that you can find online. I went out to the National Historic Park in Concord in the fall. So it's just luscious. Well, I have maybe 2 more songs for you. Okay. This next one comes from a fascinating source of what people were listening to at the time. And the song itself comes from a London play. Songs from plays in London were a major source of music in the colonies. And this play was in 1783, and in it, a Scottish soldier is asking his sweetheart if she will marry him and become a camp follower. One of the women who lived and worked with the army at the time. Their reputation today is mostly as prostitutes, and certainly some good time girls were there, but most were the wives and daughters of the soldiers, and they did the cooking and the laundry, and they nursed the wounded, and they got a small wage. And when the British left to come here, they held lotteries to see who could take along their personal support person. And we know about this song for several reasons, but one is that it was copied in a notebook by a soldier in the Pennsylvania Regiment called George Bush. He was not related to the presidential Bushes, but he subscribed to a magazine in London called the Songster's Companion, and apparently it arrived during the war. And he copied down songs like this one. This is called "Oh Say Bonnie Lass." And the soldier says, "Will you leave your mammy and daddy?" And that's how the Scots refer to their mother and father. Oh, say, bonnie lass, can you lie in a barrack and marry a soldier and carry his wallet? Oh, say, will you leave both your mammy and daddy and follow to the camp with your soldier laddie? Oh yes, I will do it and think nothing of it. I'll marry my soldier and carry his wallet. Oh yes, I will leave both my mammy and daddy and follow to the camp with my soldier laddie. Oh, say, bonnie lass, will you go a-campaigning, endure all the hardships of battle and famine? When I'm wounded and bleeding, then wilt thou draw near me and kindly support me and tenderly cheer me? Oh, say, bonnie lass, will you go into battle where drums are beating and cannon loud rattle? Oh yes, my dear lad, I will share all thy harms, and should thou be killed, I will die in thine arms. So not only does he ask if she'll marry him and look after his wallet, his knapsack with his tobacco and money in it, will she go out on tramping in the campaigns with him and starve with him, which was a major feature of campaigning back then, not having good food supplies? Will she go into battle? And some camp followers indeed did go right into the battle. Famously, one in the Battle of Monmouth was helping her husband fire his cannon. And she became the famous, or the legendary Molly Pitcher, because women also brought water to troops who would yell, "Pitcher, Molly, pitcher, I need a pitcher." So many of our ideas about who was doing what 250 years ago is seen through the lens of today. We presume there were no women in the camps, or they were certainly not on the battlefield, and we presume all kinds of things, which when you look at the history, it's very different. Well, I have a couple more bits about Yankee Doodle, and then we'll let you get on with your day. In 1781, General Henry Knox, the fellow who brought the cannon down from Ticonderoga, they were set up on Dorchester Heights, and the British woke up one morning and said, "Oh, we better leave." Well, he wrote to his wife, Lucy, when Lord Cornwallis's army surrendered in 1780. Right, 81. It was 2 years before the real end of the war, but this was a major victory. And the defeated British piled up their guns and swords in surrender. And the vanquished foes were not allowed to display their flags, and Henry writes that they were not allowed to play Yankee Doodle. That's our song now. Yeah, you wrote it to insult us, but it's our song. Well, in 1788, after the war, Massachusetts ratified the United States Constitution, and bells rang, cannons fired, and yet more verses to Yankee Doodle appeared. This song has 13 verses for each of the 13 colonies, but I'll just give you 2 because one thing is they were very long-winded back then. If you read any of their writings, they went on, and their songs had 12 or 15 or 60 verses because people had a little more time back then. So here's 2 of these verses. It says, "The Vention did in Boston meet," the convention, the Constitutional Convention. "The Vention did in Boston meet, the State House could not hold 'em. So then they went to Federal Street, and there the truth was told 'em. Every morning went to prayer, and then began disputing, till opposition silenced were by arguments refuting." Oh my gosh, they were arguing, what a surprise. "Now politicians of all kinds who are not yet decided may see how Yankees speak their minds and yet are not divided. So here I end my federal song composed of 13 verses. May agriculture flourish long and commerce fill our purses." I think it's fitting to end with money. Since you could argue it was all about money, or a great deal of it was about money, as everything always has been and always will be. So that's it. Thank you so much,
Diane. I haven't heard the federal version of that before.
Huh?
I hadn't heard the federal version before.
Yes, yes, and I love that they say Yankees speak their minds and yet are not divided. Even though there's, I love they go to prayer and then they start arguing. It's a sport.
Yes. Politics is always a sport.
Always has been.
I have left.
And arguing.
I have left a couple more links down in our chat box, one to Diane's website and one to our own colonial singers page on our own website. Diane, is there anything in particular that you would like to plug or explain how you got to be here today?
Oh, well, I think it's been 10 years now, or more than 10 years, 11 years. A former president of the Historical Society had seen some people in period attire singing at Colonial Williamsburg. And she said, "Gosh, we have people in colonial attire up in Lexington. We needed someone to teach them to sing the songs." So she hired me to do that. And all this time later, we're still doing it. And as you said, we put on the Beggar's Opera from I think it's 67 or something, in the depot there. It was great fun. And during the pandemic, we have still been meeting via Zoom. And I have found another little play to do called The Disappointment. And it's 50 years after the Beggar's Opera. It was supposed to be the first play ever put on, written by an American, a colonist, someone here in the colonies. It got canceled because it was a thinly veiled satire on people who said people will recognize us you can't hold us up to public ridicule. So it was never put on. And then it's a long story, but there were two more very sort of misguided productions. So we're going to rescue this piece and put it on for the first time with the right feel and the right music. And wait, when we can get together again, that's what we're going to be doing. We were also right on the brink of making a recording with the colonial singers before the world shut down. So, and we actually did a Kickstarter campaign. Some of you may have donated to it. I offered to give the money back, but most people said, keep it, you'll get back to it someday. And we have hopes that someday we will get back to it. And maybe we'll toss in this federal song.
I think that's a good idea. It's always nice to see, what happened after the story. Where did we actually end up?
Yes, there's if I can plug a book by Maya Jasanoff called Liberty's Exiles, the first book that systematically looks at what happened to the losers. It is, and they kept very good records, and it's fascinating, totally fascinating to see where about 55,000 loyalists had to go because they couldn't stay here. Their lands and houses were confiscated and burned, and they themselves could be killed. So they left in this huge mass, including people who owned slaves and wanted to keep them, runaway slaves who wanted to keep their freedom, and everything in between. They went to Nova Scotia, they went to Jamaica, they went to England. England had outlawed slavery, so if you wanted to keep your possessions, you needed to go someplace like Jamaica. It's a totally, totally fascinating book called Liberty's Exiles by Maya Jasanoff.
Wonderful. And we might leave with one more question. People are interested to learn more about your instruments, Diane.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, this is a dulcimer. It was created in the Appalachian Mountains in the late 1600s. I don't think there were any of these up in New England in the colonial time. It was a very simple instrument, only a few strings with wire strings, played in modes, which is what came before scales. It has the right sound for the music we're doing, but this instrument not only has the right sound, it has the right look. I've been looking for a while for the right instrument for a woman to play, since women didn't play the guitars of the time very much. Those were sort of for rowdy soldiers and sailors in taverns. They were called the Spanish guitar with gut strings. Women tended to play the English guitar. Benjamin Franklin gave one to his daughter for Christmas. And it was like a lute. It had a round body, a long neck. Once again, wire strings, like the dulcimer, not gut strings, played in octaves. And I found this online, advertised as a dulcimer guitar. And they said it had imperfections. I said, oh, little do you know. The more the better, for my purposes. I don't really know where the imperfections are. I've kept pretty good care of it. But it really has quite the right sound. And I was tickled that it was so small when it came in the box. So yes, those are my instruments. But most people did not accompany their singing. They sang, even in church, there were very few instruments. People just, your singing is available to everyone. And as well, if you're not tone deaf. Even then, you can still sing if you want to. Who can stop you?
That's great. We'll look forward to the future when we can have these theatricals and maybe get together in the tavern again and have a sing along with the public.
I know. I have been vaccinated. More and more people are. We're halfway, it said. I think we've reached a 50%. Either in Massachusetts or in the whole country. I don't know. I saw 50% in the paper and thought, that's
the whole country.
That's the whole country. See, that's
yep.
That's good. And even the famous, reluctant ones, I think the more people who are vaccinated and don't fall twitching to the sidewalk, people say, oh, look, it works. It's fine. Let's do it. So it's free. It's everywhere. So I think we're going to do a little better than the nervous Nellies on on the media. So, no, I think, and a lot of people won't have much choice if they want to go do certain things. They're going to have been vaccinated. So,
Right.
It's
The other
what
thing,
Dr. Franklin and all the historical folk who were ranting about smallpox would have wanted. Although I do always like to point out that Dr. Franklin had an honorary doctorate that he just liked to brag about. He was not actually a doctor. He knew absolutely nothing about medicine.
well, the quote I had from Henry Knox about Yankee Doodle comes from a book I just read of his letters with his wife Lucy. The poor things were newlyweds. They had a little child, and he didn't see her for 6-7 months at a crack because he was so busy with the artillery. And in the middle of all this, she and her 1-year-old daughter get inoculated. And it's a fascinating story how George Washington inoculated his entire army quietly, because if the enemy knew they were all, because it gave you a little case of smallpox. If the enemy knew, they could have just wiped them out in their beds. But somehow, that's another story that really needs to be told.
That was
How
the
they
first
managed
case
that
of
one.
biological warfare. They would shove people infested with smallpox into each other's camps to try and
Oh,
break down the opposing army.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the people back then prayed for deliverance from such epidemics. Apparently some today take a very opposite view, but I think that I don't think anyone who lived through epidemics in colonial times would it would beggar their belief that we would have any doubts about getting inoculated today.
Yeah.
One of the most prolific people who was spreading the word about vaccines was actually Cotton Mather in the first half of the 18th century, who had pretty much instigated the Salem witch trials, but somehow came around to science in the ensuing 30 years or so, which is pretty incredible to me. So there is hope. There is hope that we went from hanging witches to vaccines in the course of about 30 years.
And we can do it again.
Yes.
Right.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning. It is a beautiful day outside, so hopefully, I'm not entirely sure how many folks are out on the green this morning giving tours, but if you are in the area, I would recommend poking around. I do know that most of our pre-scheduled tours are booked at this point, but we will be open. Buckman Tavern is open now every day of the week until the end of the year. And the Hancock Clark House and Monroe Tavern are open on weekends until Memorial Day. And by then, hopefully, we will be able to have a wonderful and normal summer.
Yes, and once we're able to do it, I would invite everybody to come up to Lexington and Concord and visit and do all of the normal things that we normally like to do. And I hope today we've scratched in the space of a couple of hours, we've scratched the surface of these events. But I hope what we've done is poked a few holes to allow you to realize just how complex this history really is, how multi-layered, and how the myths sometimes get in the way of what really, really happened. So I invite you all, poke, 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 keep going at it.
And even if you're uncomfortable with the houses, just the history of the green itself, you can just stand on that green and imagine what was happening 250 years, 247 years ago.
Right, and there's an entire battle road trail too.
Yes. Yep.
The National Park is a wonderful resource.
Although on the green, there's entirely too much grass and not enough manure.
True.
Enough rocks.
Right, not enough lumps and rocks.
Lumps and
It is wonderfully landscaped. We thank the DPW for that.
Yes. The 19th century Department of Public Works, unfortunately, they made it all perfectly flat. Well, okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much,
everybody.
All of our participants and to all of our viewers. I hope you have a wonderful, safe, and happy Patriots Day, and I hope you can join us for some more programming over the course of the rest of the week.
And apologies if we didn't get to your questions, but Keith, we'll take a look. Come on up here and we'll answer them in person.
Very good. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye now.
All right. Stay safe, everyone.
Yes.